She was just a humble maid, but when she saw that 10-year-old boy pointing at her among 5 high society ladies and shouting, "I choose her to be my mother," she discovered that sometimes a child's heart sees what adults refuse to see. In Victorian England, where titles and fortunes decided destinies, a millionaire duke organized the most unusual competition in history. 5 noble ladies would compete to become the new duchess and mother to his orphaned son. London society buzzed with gossip about which candidate would win the heart of the powerful Duke Edward Montclair, but no one imagined that the final choice would be in the hands of Alexander, a 10-year-old boy who observed everything in silence. While the ladies displayed their silk dresses and precious jewels, trying to impress the Duke with their elegance and fortune, Alexander found solace in the only person who truly cared about him, Isabella, the maid of humble origins. On the day of the decisive choice, when the 5 ladies positioned themselves in the main hall expecting to be selected, Alexander shocked all of English aristocracy by making a declaration that would change his life forever and challenge all social conventions of the era. This is the story of how true love triumphed over class prejudices, how a child's wisdom revealed adult hypocrisy, and how a simple maid became the most respected duchess in all of England, but not before facing scandals, betrayals, and an entire society determined to destroy her. But before we continue, check if you are already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Duke Edward Montclair stood before the great window of his study, watching the gardens of Montclair Castle extend as far as the eye could see. 6 months had passed since Lady Catherine, his beloved wife and mother to young Alexander, had succumbed to tuberculosis. The vast estate that once echoed with laughter and music now felt like a mausoleum of memories. Edward, at 35 years old, found himself not only grieving the loss of his soulmate, but also grappling with the immense responsibility of raising their 10-year-old son alone. The Duke was a man accustomed to control. His vast fortune, built through shrewd investments in railways and textile mills, afforded him influence that reached the highest echelons of British society. Yet grief had rendered him powerless, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed foreign without Catherine's guiding presence. The castle's 150 rooms felt oppressive, each corner holding memories that both comforted and tormented him. Alexander had withdrawn into himself since his mother's death. The once vibrant boy who had filled the halls with his laughter now moved through the castle like a spectre, spending hours in the library or wandering the extensive gardens alone. Edward watched his son's isolation with growing concern, recognizing in the child's behavior his own tendency to retreat from emotional pain into solitude. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Persian rugs as Edward contemplated the decision that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. Alexander needed a mother figure, someone who could provide the warmth and nurturing that he, despite his love for his son, felt incapable of offering in his current state. The boy's education was being handled adequately by his tutors, but Edward could see that scholarly lessons were not enough to heal the wound left by Catherine's absence. Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, had approached him several times about Alexander's declining spirits. She reported that the boy barely touched his meals and had been found crying in his mother's former sitting room on multiple occasions. The household staff, despite their genuine affection for the young master, could only do so much within the boundaries of their positions. Edward knew that decisive action was required, but the very thought of replacing Catherine felt like a betrayal of her memory. Isabella Hartwell moved through the morning routine with quiet efficiency, her footsteps barely audible on the marble floors of the castle's east wing. At 23 years old, she possessed a natural grace that seemed at odds with her humble position as a lady's maid and governess assistant. Having served the Montclair household for 3 years, she had witnessed firsthand the family's devastating loss and its aftermath. Unlike the other servants who maintained a respectful distance from the grieving family, Isabella found herself naturally drawn to young Alexander's plight. Perhaps it was because she, too, had lost her parents at a tender age, or perhaps it was the genuine kindness that seemed to radiate from her very being. Whatever the reason, she had become the one person in the castle who could coax a smile from the boy's solemn face. This particular morning, as she arranged fresh flowers in the morning room, Isabella noticed Alexander sitting alone on the garden bench, where he and his mother used to read together. His small shoulders were hunched with the weight of grief that no child should bear. Without hesitation, She set down her work and stepped into the garden, approaching him with the same gentle manner she had learned to use with wounded animals during her childhood in the countryside. "Good morning, Master Alexander," she said softly, settling beside him on the bench without being invited. This small breach of protocol had become their unspoken understanding over the past months. "The roses are particularly beautiful today, do you not think?" Alexander looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his 10 years. "Mother loved the roses," he said quietly. "She said they were like her love for father and me, beautiful, but with thorns to protect what was precious." Isabella nodded thoughtfully, understanding that the boy needed to speak of his mother, not forget her. "Your mother was a wise woman, and very beautiful. I think she would want you to find joy in the roses again, even while remembering her with love." The conversation continued in this manner, with Isabella listening more than speaking, offering gentle guidance rather than empty platitudes. She had an intuitive understanding that grief needed to be honored, not hurried past. As they sat together, she began to share stories from her own childhood, carefully chosen tales that spoke of loss and healing without being heavy-handed in their message. By the time the morning sun had climbed high enough to warm their faces, Alexander had straightened somewhat, and Isabella had seen the ghost of a smile cross his features. These small victories had become precious to her, worth more than any formal recognition of her growing role in the boy's emotional recovery. The oak-paneled walls of Duke Edward's study seemed to close in around him as he penned what would become one of the most controversial letters in London society's recent memory. 3 weeks had passed since his conversation with the family solicitor, who had delicately suggested that remarriage might be the most practical solution to Alexander's need for maternal guidance. The idea had initially repulsed Edward, but as he watched his son's continued struggle with grief, pragmatism began to override sentimentality. Edward had compiled a list of 5 suitable candidates from among London's most eligible widows and unmarried women of appropriate age and station. Each possessed the breeding, education, and social connections that would make them acceptable Duchess material. Lady Margaret Ashworth, at 28, was the daughter of an earl and possessed considerable wealth in her own right. Lady Victoria Pemberton, 26, was renowned for her beauty and had been courted by half of London's bachelors. The Honourable Miss Constance Blackwood brought political connections through her father's position in Parliament. Lady Eleanor Sinclair, a widow of 30 with her own vast inheritance, rounded out the group along with Miss Arabella Worthington, whose family owned extensive properties in Scotland. Each woman represented a strategic alliance that could benefit both families, while providing Alexander with a stepmother of unquestionable social standing. The letter he crafted was formal yet warm, extending an invitation for these distinguished ladies to spend a month at Montclair Castle as his house guests. He explained his situation with careful discretion, emphasizing his desire to provide young Alexander with proper maternal guidance while acknowledging his own need for companionship in managing his vast responsibilities. The invitation was presented as an opportunity for mutual acquaintance, though the underlying purpose was clear to anyone versed in the subtle communications of their social class. Edward sealed each letter with his ducal ring, the weight of the wax seeming to symbolize the gravity of his decision. He had informed Alexander of his intentions in the gentlest terms possible, explaining that several ladies would be visiting to see if one might become a suitable addition to their family. The boy had received this news with the same polite resignation he had shown to most developments since his mother's death, neither enthusiasm nor protest coloring his response. As Edward handed the letters to his secretary for immediate dispatch, he felt both relief at having taken decisive action and a gnawing uncertainty about the wisdom of his choice. The die was cast, and within a fortnight, Montclair Castle would be transformed into the stage for a most unusual courtship. The arrival of Duke Edward's letters created ripples of excitement throughout London's drawing rooms that quickly swelled into waves of speculation and anticipation. Lady Margaret Ashworth received her invitation while taking tea with her mother, the Countess of Pembroke, who immediately began planning what she declared would be the most strategic campaign of the season. Within hours of the letter's delivery, a network of gossip had spread the news through every fashionable household in Mayfair. The prospect of one of their number becoming the next Duchess of Montclair was tantalizing enough, but the unusual nature of the arrangement, with 5 candidates invited simultaneously, added a delicious element of competition that had society matrons rubbing their hands in anticipation. Lady Victoria Pemberton, upon reading her invitation in her father's library, immediately summoned her lady's maid to begin planning an extensive wardrobe suitable for a month-long house party where the stakes could not be higher. Her mother, Lady Pemberton, dispatched servants to gather intelligence about the other invited ladies and to research every detail of Duke Edward's preferences and habits. The betting books at White's and other gentlemen's clubs began filling with wagers about which lady would capture the Duke's heart. The odds favoured Lady Eleanor Sinclair, whose widowed status and experience managing a large household were seen as practical advantages. However, Lady Victoria's legendary beauty made her a close second in the speculation, while Lady Margaret's impeccable bloodlines and substantial dowry kept her firmly in contention. Miss Constance Blackwood's father saw political opportunity in the match and immediately began cultivating support among his parliamentary colleagues, while Miss Arabella Worthington's family started liquidating certain Scottish investments to ensure their daughter would arrive at Montclair Castle with the most impressive jewellery collection possible. The preparation frenzy extended beyond the invited ladies themselves. Dressmakers across London found themselves inundated with rush orders for gowns suitable for every occasion, from morning walks to formal dinners. Milliners worked around the clock, creating hats that would complement carefully planned ensembles, while jewelers polished family heirloom pieces and created new settings for precious stones. Meanwhile, gossip columnists sharpened their pens in anticipation of what promised to be the most closely watched social event of the year. The combination of romance, competition, and vast wealth created irresistible material for society's entertainment, and everyone from duchess to scullery maid had an opinion about which lady would emerge victorious. While London society buzzed with anticipation about the upcoming competition for the Duke's hand, life at Montclair Castle continued its quiet rhythm of healing and routine. Isabella Hartwell found herself increasingly concerned about young Alexander's reaction to the news of his father's marriage plans. Though the boy had accepted the information with characteristic politeness, she could see the anxiety lurking behind his composed exterior. During their daily walks through the castle's extensive gardens, Alexander had begun asking Isabella questions that revealed his deep worries about the impending changes to his life. "Do you think the new mother will want to change everything?" he asked one afternoon as they paused beside the ornamental lake, where swans glided serenely across the water's surface. Isabella chose her words carefully, understanding that her response could significantly impact the boy's emotional preparation for the coming weeks. "Change is often difficult, Master Alexander, but it is not always bad. Perhaps the lady your father chooses will bring new joys, while respecting the precious memories you hold of your dear mother." Alexander nodded thoughtfully, then surprised Isabella with a question that revealed his remarkable perceptiveness. "Isabella, why do you think father did not ask me what kind of new mother I might want?" The question struck Isabella as both poignant and astute. In her own humble background, family decisions were often made collectively, with even children's voices carrying weight in matters that affected them directly. The aristocratic tradition of fathers making unilateral decisions about family structure, while accepted as natural by those born to it, seemed harsh when viewed through the lens of a grieving child's needs. "Perhaps," Isabella said gently, "your father believes he knows best what will make you happy. Parents sometimes forget that children have wisdom about their own needs. Their conversations during these private moments had evolved beyond the formal boundaries typically maintained between servants and their employers' children." Isabella found herself sharing memories of her own childhood losses and the comfort she had found in unexpected sources of kindness. Alexander, in turn, began expressing feelings about his mother's death that he had never voiced to his father or anyone else in the household. These exchanges created an intimacy of understanding that neither Isabella nor Alexander fully recognized for what it was becoming. To Isabella, she was simply offering comfort to a child who needed it. To Alexander, Isabella represented safety, genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings, and the kind of unconditional acceptance he had once received from his mother. The first week of October brought crisp autumn air and the arrival of Duke Edward's distinguished guests. Montclair Castle, which had stood quiet and somewhat melancholy for the past 6 months, suddenly burst into activity as carriages began arriving in stately procession along the circular drive. The staff, under Mrs. Whitmore's expert direction, had spent days preparing the guest quarters and planning a series of entertainments appropriate for such exalted visitors. Lady Margaret Ashworth arrived first, her travelling coach bearing the Pembroke family crest and accompanied by a second carriage containing her lady's maid, personal secretary, and enough luggage to suggest an extended siege rather than a month-long visit. She emerged from her carriage with practiced grace, her travelling costume of emerald silk showcasing both her fashion sense and her family's considerable wealth. Duke Edward greeted each guest personally, his natural charm and refined manners setting a tone of warm hospitality despite the underlying competition. Lady Victoria Pemberton's arrival created the anticipated stir among the male servants, her legendary beauty living up to its reputation even after hours of travel. Miss Constance Blackwood brought with her an air of intellectual sophistication that was immediately apparent in her thoughtful questions about the castle's history and architecture. Lady Eleanor Sinclair's entrance was marked by quiet confidence rather than dramatic flair. As an experienced widow who had successfully managed her own household and social obligations, she observed the proceedings with the calculating eye of someone well versed in the subtle dynamics of power and influence. Miss Arabella Worthington completed the group, her Scottish accent and forthright manner providing an interesting contrast to the more reserved English sensibilities of her fellow candidates. Alexander was formally introduced to each lady during the welcome dinner held in the castle's grand dining room. The boy conducted himself with impeccable manners, answering polite inquiries about his studies and interests with responses that satisfied the requirements of courtesy without revealing anything of his true feelings about the situation. Isabella served during this dinner, her presence so unobtrusive that the guests barely registered her existence, despite her efficiency in ensuring that every need was met seamlessly. She alone noticed Alexander's subtle signs of discomfort, the way his hands trembled slightly when cutting his meat, how he barely touched the elaborate courses despite Mrs. Whitmore's obvious efforts to impress the visitors, and the fixed smile that never reached his eyes throughout the evening's conversation. The five ladies, meanwhile, had begun their subtle assessment of both the Duke and each other, each seeking advantages that might distinguish her from her competitors while maintaining the facade of gracious friendship that society demanded. The morning following the ladies' arrival dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the carefully orchestrated activities Duke Edward had planned to help his guests become acquainted with both the estate and young Alexander. A tour of the castle's extensive grounds was scheduled for the morning, followed by afternoon tea in the conservatory, and an informal dinner where the ladies might demonstrate their conversational skills and knowledge of current affairs. Lady Margaret Ashworth immediately distinguished herself by displaying an encyclopedic knowledge of English history, regaling the group with fascinating details about Montclair Castle's construction and its role in various historical events. Her research had been thorough, and Duke Edward found himself genuinely impressed by her scholarship and the thoughtful questions she asked about his family's legacy. Lady Victoria Pemberton took a different approach, focusing her attention on Alexander with what appeared to be genuine maternal interest. She inquired about his favourite subjects, praised his excellent posture and manners, and made several observations about his resemblance to his father that were calculated to please both males in her audience. However, Isabella, observing from her position of invisible service, noticed that Lady Victoria's smiles never extended to her eyes when Alexander was not looking directly at her. Miss Constance Blackwood impressed the Duke with her knowledge of current political developments and her thoughtful opinions on social issues affecting the realm. Her father's position in Parliament had clearly provided her with insights that went beyond typical feminine accomplishments, and she demonstrated an intellectual depth that Duke Edward found stimulating after months of social isolation. Lady Eleanor Sinclair's strategy was more subtle, but perhaps more effective. Rather than competing directly with her younger rivals in beauty or accomplishments, she positioned herself as the practical choice, someone who could seamlessly step into the role of duchess and stepmother without requiring extensive adjustment periods. Her experience managing her late husband's estate and her understanding of aristocratic responsibilities made her an obviously sensible selection. Miss Arabella Worthington charmed everyone with her straightforward Scottish manner and her impressive knowledge of land management and agricultural improvements. Her family's extensive properties had given her practical experience that complemented her natural intelligence, and she spoke knowledgeably about topics that directly related to Duke Edward's business interests. Alexander participated in these activities with polite attention but growing weariness. Each lady made efforts to engage him in conversation, but their approaches felt artificial to his sensitive nature. They asked questions about his preferences and opinions, yet he sensed that their interest was performative rather than genuine, designed more to impress his father than to understand him as an individual. While the 5 distinguished ladies competed for Duke Edward's attention through displays of wit, beauty, and accomplishment, Isabella Hartwell continued her duties with heightened awareness of the undercurrents flowing through the castle's daily routine. Her position as a servant granted her a unique vantage point from which to observe the authentic behavior of both the candidates and young Alexander when they believed themselves unobserved. During the morning room service, Isabella noticed Lady Margaret Ashworth's impatience when Alexander accidentally knocked over his teacup, her momentary flash of annoyance quickly concealed behind a practiced smile. Later, while dusting the library, she overheard Lady Victoria Pemberton speaking to her maid about Alexander, in terms that suggested she viewed him more as an obstacle to overcome than as a child to nurture. "The boy is well-mannered enough," Lady Victoria had said while having her hair arranged, "but rather withdrawn. Once I am established as Duchess, proper discipline and structured activities should remedy that easily enough." The comment had sent a chill through Isabella's heart, not because of any malicious intent on Lady Victoria's part, but because it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Alexander's needs. The boy did not require more discipline or structure. He needed understanding, patience, and genuine affection to help him heal from his profound loss. Miss Constance Blackwood's approach was more intellectual, treating Alexander like a small adult and engaging him in conversations about his studies that were impressive in their sophistication but exhausting in their intensity. Isabella watched the boy struggle to meet her expectations while clearly longing for simpler, more emotionally nurturing interactions. Lady Eleanor Sinclair demonstrated competent maternal skills, but with the efficiency of someone managing necessary tasks rather than delighting in a child's company. Her interactions with Alexander were appropriate and kind, but lacked the warmth that might have comforted his grieving heart. Miss Arabella Worthington showed perhaps the most natural affinity for children, her Scottish straightforwardness translating into honest, uncomplicated conversations with Alexander. However, even her genuine kindness felt somewhat detached, as if she were being nice to her friend's child rather than developing a real emotional connection. Isabella found herself comparing these interactions to her own daily exchanges with Alexander, recognizing how naturally their relationship had evolved into something deeper than formal duty. When Alexander sought her out each afternoon for their garden walks, his relief at escaping the constant evaluation by his potential stepmothers was palpable. During these precious moments of freedom, he would share his honest reactions to the day's events, his confusion about adult expectations, and his fears about how his life might change. As the second week of the lady's visit commenced, Alexander Montclair found himself increasingly overwhelmed by the constant scrutiny and forced interactions that had become his daily reality. Each morning brought new tests disguised as pleasant activities, walks where he was expected to demonstrate his knowledge of botany, tea times where his table manners were subtly evaluated, and educational discussions that felt more like examinations than conversations. The weight of knowing that his father expected him to develop a preference among the 5 candidates created a pressure that the 10-year-old struggled to understand, much less manage. During a particularly difficult afternoon, when Lady Margaret Ashworth had quizzed him extensively about Latin conjugations, while Lady Victoria Pemberton corrected his posture, Alexander retreated to his mother's former sitting room, a space that had been preserved exactly as she had left it. Isabella discovered him there an hour later, curled in his mother's favorite chair with tears streaming down his face. The sight broke her heart, and she abandoned all pretense of maintaining proper servant boundaries as she knelt beside the chair and gently took his small hands in hers. "Master Alexander, what troubles you so deeply?" she asked, her voice filled with the maternal tenderness that came naturally to her despite her youth and unmarried status. "I cannot choose, Isabella," Alexander whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Father expects me to like one of them better than the others, but they all make me feel empty inside. They speak to me as if I am a puzzle to be solved, rather than a person with feelings. Isabella's heart ached for the boy's distress, recognizing that he was articulating something many adults failed to understand. Children could sense authenticity and responded to genuine emotional connection rather than practiced charm or calculated kindness. "They are all accomplished ladies," Alexander continued, "and I know Father hopes one of them will make me happy. But when I am with them, I feel more alone than I did before they came. Is something wrong with me, Isabella?" The question revealed the depth of Alexander's self-doubt and confusion, and Isabella felt a surge of protective anger toward the adults who had placed such an impossible burden on a grieving child's shoulders. She chose her words carefully, knowing that her response might significantly influence Alexander's understanding of his own emotional needs. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with you, dear boy," she said firmly. "Your feelings are honest and important, and you should never apologize for knowing what brings you comfort and what does not. Sometimes adults forget that children are not small adults who can simply decide to feel differently about people." Their conversation continued in hushed tones, with Alexander gradually revealing his deepest fears about the future, and Isabella offering the kind of understanding and validation he desperately needed. Duke Edward Montclair stood in his private study reviewing the mental notes he had been keeping about each of his houseguests as the third week of their visit drew to a close. His original plan of allowing natural affections to develop between Alexander and one of the candidates had proven more challenging than anticipated, as the boy maintained polite but distant relationships with all 5 ladies despite their varied efforts to win his favor. Lady Margaret Ashworth had demonstrated impressive intellectual capabilities and would clearly be an asset in managing the social and cultural responsibilities that came with the duchy. Her knowledge of art, literature, and history would make her an excellent hostess for the political gatherings and cultural events that were part of his aristocratic duties. However, Edward had noticed a subtle impatience in her demeanor when dealing with Alexander's more emotional needs, suggesting she might view motherhood more as a duty than a joy. Lady Victoria Pemberton's beauty and charm would undoubtedly enhance his social standing, and her accomplishments in music and languages were considerable. Yet Edward's growing paternal awareness had made him sensitive to the performative quality of her interactions with Alexander, as if she were playing a role rather than expressing genuine maternal feelings. Miss Constance Blackwood's political connections and intellectual stimulation appealed to Edward's practical nature, but he worried that her somewhat overwhelming intensity might not provide the gentle comfort Alexander seemed to need. Lady Eleanor Sinclair represented the safest choice, her experience and competence ensuring smooth household management, but Edward found himself questioning whether safety and efficiency were sufficient foundations for family happiness. Miss Arabella Worthington had surprised him with her business acumen and her refreshingly direct manner of communication, but her Scottish heritage, while not disqualifying, would require certain social adjustments that might complicate his political relationships. The most troubling aspect of the entire situation was Alexander's obvious lack of enthusiasm for any of the candidates. Edward had hoped to see some spark of connection, some indication that his son was forming a bond with one of the ladies, but instead he witnessed increasing withdrawal and what appeared to be resigned politeness rather than genuine affection. His conversations with Alexander about the visitors yielded only diplomatic responses that revealed nothing of the boy's true feelings. When pressed for preferences, Alexander would make appropriate comments about each lady's virtues, while carefully avoiding any expression of personal preference or emotional attachment. Edward began to question whether his approach had been fundamentally flawed, whether forcing such an important decision within an artificial time frame was fair to either Alexander or the ladies involved. Late one evening, as Duke Edward struggled with his concerns about Alexander's lack of connection with any of the potential stepmothers, he found himself drawn to his late wife's portrait in the castle's main gallery. Lady Catherine's painted eyes seemed to hold the gentle wisdom that had guided their family through countless decisions during their years together, and Edward felt an overwhelming need for her counsel in this most crucial choice. Standing before the portrait in the flickering candlelight, Edward recalled conversations he and Catherine had shared about parenting philosophy and their hopes for Alexander's future. Catherine had always insisted that love could not be commanded or scheduled, that it arose naturally from understanding and genuine care rather than from social compatibility or practical considerations. "Our child knows when affection is real," Catherine had once said during a discussion about Alexander's relationships with various relatives and family friends. "They cannot be fooled by pretty words or expensive gifts if the heart behind them is not truly engaged. Alexander will always need people who see him for who he is, not what he represents or what they hope to gain from him." These remembered words struck Edward with uncomfortable recognition as he considered the past 3 weeks of observing his son's interactions with the 5 distinguished candidates. Perhaps Alexander's withdrawal was not stubborn resistance, but rather an intuitive recognition that none of these accomplished women were truly seeing him as an individual child worthy of love for his own sake. Edward began to reflect on his own childhood experiences, remembering how naturally he had gravitated toward family members and servants who had shown genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings rather than those who had treated him primarily as the heir to be shaped according to adult expectations. His fondest memories were not of formal lessons or structured activities, but of spontaneous conversations and shared moments of discovery with people who had cared about his happiness. The realization that he might be forcing Alexander into the same kind of emotionally hollow relationships that had characterized some of his own youth filled Edward with doubt about his entire approach to resolving their family situation. Perhaps what Alexander needed was not a socially appropriate stepmother selected from among the suitable candidates, but rather someone who had already demonstrated the capacity to understand and nurture his emotional needs. As Edward continued his solitary vigil before Catherine's portrait, he found himself thinking about the various members of his household staff and their interactions with Alexander over the past months. Most maintained appropriate professional distance, but there was one exception that he had perhaps been too preoccupied to fully notice. The following morning brought an unexpected opportunity for Duke Edward to observe Isabella Hartwell's interactions with Alexander without the artificial constraints of the ongoing courtship activities. Lady Victoria Pemberton had developed a severe headache and requested a quiet morning, while the other ladies had chosen to write correspondence in their rooms, leaving Alexander free from his usual obligations to be charming and entertaining to his potential stepmothers. Edward had intended to spend the morning reviewing estate accounts in his study, but the sound of laughter from the garden drew his attention to the window. Below he could see Alexander and Isabella engaged in what appeared to be an impromptu lesson about the different types of birds that frequented the castle grounds. Isabella was pointing out various species, while Alexander took careful notes in a small journal, both of them completely absorbed in their shared discovery. What struck Edward most forcefully was the natural ease of their interaction. Isabella treated Alexander neither as a small adult to be intellectually challenged, nor as a fragile child to be carefully managed, but simply as a person whose curiosity and interests deserved respectful attention. When Alexander asked questions, Isabella listened thoughtfully before responding, and when she shared information, it was with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely excited to pass along knowledge rather than someone performing educational duties. Edward found himself studying Isabella's manner more carefully than he had ever done before. Her gentle confidence with Alexander suggested a natural maternal instinct that was neither forced nor self-conscious. She seemed to intuitively understand when to offer guidance and when to allow Alexander the freedom to explore independently, creating an environment where learning felt like adventure rather than obligation. When Alexander stumbled while trying to get a better view of a nest high in an oak tree, Isabella's immediate response revealed much about her character. She did not rush to prevent him from taking reasonable risks, nor did she dismiss his minor scrape with casual indifference. Instead, she helped him assess whether he was truly hurt, praised his determination to see the baby birds, and suggested a safer approach that would still satisfy his curiosity. "You have your mother's courage," Isabella told Alexander as she helped him brush dirt from his clothes. "But perhaps we can find a way to combine courage with wisdom, as she would have done." The comment, so naturally spoken and clearly heartfelt, demonstrated Isabella's remarkable sensitivity to Alexander's need to maintain connection with his mother's memory while still embracing new experiences. Rather than competing with Catherine's ghost or trying to replace irreplaceable memories, Isabella was helping Alexander integrate his grief into a continuing relationship with life and growth. That afternoon, as Duke Edward attempted to focus on correspondence with his various business managers, he found his thoughts continually returning to the scene he had witnessed in the garden. The contrast between Isabella's natural, nurturing relationship with Alexander and the more formal, calculated interactions the boy had experienced with his potential stepmothers was becoming impossible to ignore. Edward began to recall other instances over the past months when Isabella had demonstrated qualities that he had been too grief-stricken or preoccupied to fully appreciate. During Alexander's bout with influenza in late spring, it had been Isabella who had sat with the boy through feverish nights, reading to him, and providing the gentle comfort that had aided his recovery. When Alexander had struggled with nightmares following his mother's death, Isabella had somehow intuited his need for reassurance, without making him feel ashamed of his fears. Most significantly, Isabella had managed to encourage Alexander's healing and growth without ever trying to diminish or replace his memories of his mother. She spoke naturally of Catherine in present conversations, helping Alexander maintain his connection to his mother's love while still engaging with the living world around him. This delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the future was something that none of the 5 distinguished candidates had achieved, despite their various efforts to position themselves as suitable maternal figures. Edward realized that his approach to solving Alexander's need for a mother had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. He had focused on finding a woman who could fulfill the social and practical requirements of being a duchess and stepmother, while overlooking the person who had already proven her capacity to provide Alexander with genuine maternal love and guidance. The recognition brought with it a host of complex considerations that challenged every assumption Edward had made about appropriate social arrangements. Isabella was not of noble birth. Her education had been practical rather than classical, and her family connections offered no political or economic advantages. By every conventional measure used to evaluate potential duchesses, she fell far short of acceptable standards. Yet when Edward honestly examined what Alexander needed most desperately, Isabella possessed every essential quality in abundance. She understood the boy's emotional needs, respected his intelligence without overwhelming him with unrealistic expectations, and had demonstrated unwavering loyalty and affection toward their family during its most difficult period. The thought of elevating a servant to the position of duchess was so revolutionary that Edward's initial reaction was to dismiss it as impossible. The social upheaval such a decision would create, the damage to his political relationships, and the scandal it would generate throughout English society all seemed like insurmountable obstacles. The morning of the 25th day of the lady's visit dawned grey and drizzling, matching Alexander's increasingly desperate mood as he contemplated his father's expectation that he would soon express a preference among the 5 candidates. The weight of this impossible choice had been growing heavier each day, and Alexander felt trapped between his desire to please his father and his honest inability to feel genuine affection for any of the distinguished ladies. During what had become his daily refuge, a private walk with Isabella through the less formal sections of the castle grounds, Alexander finally voiced the fears that had been consuming him. They had paused beside the small stream that ran through the estate's woodland area, a place where the formality of castle life seemed distant, and Alexander could speak freely without fear of being overheard. "Isabella," he said quietly, his voice carrying a tremor that revealed the depth of his distress, "I think I am going to disappoint Father terribly." Isabella settled beside him on a fallen log, her attention completely focused on the troubled boy. "What makes you feel that way, dear one?" "He expects me to choose one of the ladies to be my new mother, but I cannot make myself feel what I know I should feel," Alexander explained, his words tumbling out in a rush of pent-up anxiety. "They are all accomplished and beautiful and kind in their way, but when I imagine living every day with one of them as my mother, I feel empty inside." The confession revealed Alexander's remarkable emotional intelligence, his ability to distinguish between superficial pleasantries and the deeper connections that sustain family relationships. Isabella recognized that the boy was not being difficult or ungrateful, but rather honestly acknowledging that love could not be manufactured through effort or good intentions alone. "Alexander," Isabella said gently, taking his small hands in hers, "your feelings are not wrong or disappointing. Love grows naturally like the flowers in our garden. It cannot be forced to bloom simply because we think it should." Alexander looked up at her with eyes full of desperate hope. "But what will I tell father? He has invested so much in bringing these ladies here, and I know he wants me to be happy. How can I explain that the only person who makes me feel truly safe and loved is—" He paused, his cheeks coloring with embarrassment. "Is who, dear one?" Isabella prompted softly. "Is you," Alexander whispered, the words barely audible above the gentle babbling of the stream. "When I imagine having a new mother, I do not picture any of those fine ladies. I picture you, Isabella. You are the one who understands my fears, who listens to my thoughts, who makes me feel that mother's love continues through your kindness." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes at the boy's heartfelt confession, even as her practical mind immediately recognized the impossibility of what he was suggesting. "Oh, Alexander, your words touch my heart more deeply than you could know, but you must understand that there are rules about such things. I am a servant, and your father is a duke. The world does not allow for such arrangements." "But why?" Alexander asked with the direct logic of childhood. "If you love me as a son, and I love you as a mother, and if you would make father happy too, why should it matter what the world thinks?" The question struck at the heart of Isabella's own growing feelings about her place in the Montclair household, feelings she had been carefully suppressing as inappropriate and impossible. As the fourth week of their extended visit began, tension among the 5 candidates had reached a level that even the most polished social graces could not entirely conceal. The unusual nature of their situation, competing openly for the same prize while maintaining facades of friendship, had created undercurrents of rivalry that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Lady Margaret Ashworth had begun to express private frustration to her maid about Duke Edward's apparent indecision and young Alexander's continued reserve toward all of them. "I have demonstrated every qualification a duchess should possess," she complained while having her morning hair arranged. "Yet the Duke seems no closer to making a selection than when we arrived." Lady Victoria Pemberton's approach had evolved from gentle maternal overtures toward Alexander to more assertive attempts to position herself as the obvious choice through her superior beauty and accomplishments. She had taken to arranging herself in the most flattering light whenever Duke Edward was present, and had begun making subtle references to the political advantages her family connections could provide. Miss Constance Blackwood's intellectual pride had been stung by Alexander's polite but distant responses to her educational initiatives. She had prepared extensive discussions about history, literature, and natural philosophy, expecting to impress both father and son with her scholarly abilities, but Alexander's obvious preference for simpler, more emotionally nurturing interactions had left her feeling undervalued and confused. Lady Eleanor Sinclair, perhaps the most pragmatic of the 5, had begun to suspect that some factor beyond their control was influencing the situation. Her experience as a widow had taught her to read social situations carefully, and she sensed that Duke Edward was wrestling with considerations that went beyond the obvious qualifications each candidate possessed. Miss Arabella Worthington's straightforward Scottish nature made her the most vocal about their shared predicament. During a private conversation with Lady Margaret in the morning room, she expressed what they were all beginning to feel. "Something is not right about this entire arrangement. The Duke seems distracted, the boy shows no preference for any of us, and I am beginning to wonder if we are wasting our time here." Their frustrations were compounded by their growing awareness that Alexander actively sought opportunities to avoid their company, often disappearing for long periods with various servants, or finding excuses to spend time in areas of the castle where they were less likely to encounter him. When pressed to participate in activities designed to showcase their maternal potential, Alexander participated with such obvious reluctance that even the most optimistic among them began to question whether genuine affection would ever develop. The ladies had also begun to notice Isabella's frequent presence during their interactions with Alexander, initially dismissing her as simply another servant performing her duties. However, the ease of communication between the maid and the boy had started to draw their attention in ways that made them increasingly uncomfortable. That evening, as Isabella prepared for bed in her small chamber in the servants' quarters, she found herself unable to dismiss Alexander's heartfelt words from her mind. The boy's confession had awakened feelings she had been carefully suppressing for months, forcing her to acknowledge the depth of her attachment to both Alexander and, if she was entirely honest with herself, to Duke Edward as well. Over the course of her 3 years in service at Montclair Castle, Isabella had watched Duke Edward navigate the challenges of aristocratic responsibility with a combination of strength and compassion that had gradually earned her deepest respect and admiration. During the dark months following Lady Catherine's death, she had witnessed his struggle to balance his own grief with his concern for Alexander's well-being, and her heart had gone out to him in ways that went far beyond appropriate servant loyalty. The recognition of her own feelings terrified Isabella, not only because of the impossible social gulf between them, but also because she understood how dangerous such emotions could be for someone in her position. Servants who developed inappropriate attachments to their employers faced immediate dismissal and social ruin, their reputations destroyed, and their prospects for future employment eliminated. Yet, as she sat brushing her long brown hair by candlelight, Isabella could not deny that Alexander's innocent suggestion had awakened dreams she had never dared to acknowledge. She imagined what it might feel like to openly express the maternal love she felt for the boy, to comfort his fears without maintaining careful boundaries, to participate in his education and development as a true guardian rather than a servant assigned to his care. More dangerously, she allowed herself to imagine what it might mean to stand beside Duke Edward, not as an employee, but as a partner in raising Alexander and managing the responsibilities that came with their vast estate. She had observed his decision-making processes closely enough to understand the burdens he carried, and she believed she could offer not only emotional support, but practical assistance in ways that went far beyond traditional feminine accomplishments. These thoughts were both exhilarating and heartbreaking, representing everything she longed for and everything she could never have. Isabella understood that even entertaining such possibilities was a form of self-torture, yet she found herself unable to completely dismiss them, especially when she remembered the gratitude and warmth she had occasionally glimpsed in Duke Edward's eyes during moments when she had successfully comforted Alexander or anticipated some household need. The sound of rain against her small window reminded her of her current reality. She was a servant, albeit a valued one, whose future security depended entirely on maintaining appropriate boundaries and fulfilling her assigned duties with discretion and competence. Unable to sleep, Duke Edward found himself walking the halls of his ancestral home in the early hours of the morning, his mind churning with the decision that he knew could no longer be postponed. The month-long visit he had arranged was drawing to a close, and he would soon be expected to declare his intentions regarding marriage and Alexander's need for a new mother. As he paused outside Alexander's door, he could hear the boy talking quietly to someone, and his initial assumption was that one of the ladies had perhaps come to offer comfort for a nightmare. However, as he listened more carefully, he realized that Alexander was alone, engaged in what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with his mother's portrait, which hung beside his bed. "Mother," Alexander was saying softly, "I do not know what to do. Father expects me to choose among the ladies, but none of them feel right. They are all accomplished and kind, but they do not understand me the way Isabella does. Is it wrong of me to wish that Isabella could be my new mother instead? She makes me feel safe and loved, just as you did." The innocent confession struck Edward like a physical blow, not because of any impropriety, but because it revealed the depth of his own blindness to what had been developing right under his nose. Alexander's words continued, expressing feelings that the boy had clearly been harboring for weeks while struggling to meet his father's expectations. "Isabella says that love cannot be forced, that it must grow naturally. I think my love for her has been growing for a long time, ever since she first helped me when I missed you so terribly. She never tries to replace you, Mother, but she helps me remember that love continues even when people go away." Edward stepped back from the door, his heart pounding with the recognition that his son had already found the mother he needed, but she was someone whose social position made the attachment seem impossible. The irony was not lost on him that while he had been orchestrating an elaborate courtship with 5 eminently suitable candidates, the answer to their families' needs had been quietly caring for them both with unassuming devotion. As he continued his restless wandering through the castle corridors, Edward found his steps leading him toward the servants' quarters, though he told himself he was simply making a general inspection of the household's security. When he passed Isabella's door, he noticed the faint glow of candlelight beneath it, and realized she was also awake in the quiet hours of the night. The knowledge that she might be lying sleepless just as he was, possibly wrestling with thoughts and feelings that paralleled his own growing recognition of her importance to their family, filled him with an urgent need to understand her perspective on the situation that was tearing him between duty and desire, between social expectations and personal happiness. The next morning brought crisp autumn air and the kind of golden sunlight that made the castle grounds appear particularly magnificent. Duke Edward had spent the remainder of the night in his study, wrestling with thoughts and realizations that challenged every assumption he had held about duty, propriety, and the nature of love itself. By dawn, he had reached a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He sought out Isabella as she was beginning her morning duties, finding her in the morning room where she was arranging fresh flowers with the same quiet grace that characterized all her activities. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying an unusual formality that immediately caught her attention, "might I speak with you privately in my study?" Isabella's heart began to race with anxiety as she followed Duke Edward through the castle corridors, her mind immediately jumping to fears that she had somehow overstepped her bounds, or that her growing attachment to Alexander had been noticed and was being deemed inappropriate. She entered the oak-paneled study with the careful composure that years of service had taught her to maintain, regardless of her internal turmoil. "Please, sit down," Duke Edward said, gesturing to one of the comfortable chairs that faced his desk rather than the straight-back chair typically provided for servants. The gesture itself suggested that this was not an ordinary employer-employee conversation, and Isabella perched nervously on the edge of the offered seat. Duke Edward studied her face for a long moment before beginning to speak, and Isabella was struck by the vulnerability she saw in his expression, so different from his usual aristocratic composure. "Isabella, I find myself in need of your honest counsel regarding a matter of the utmost importance to both Alexander and myself." The request for her opinion, rather than simple obedience to instructions, was so unprecedented that Isabella felt momentarily speechless. "Of course, Your Grace. I am honored that you would seek my thoughts on any matter. Over the past month, I have been observing Alexander's interactions with the ladies I invited here as potential candidates for marriage and motherhood," Duke Edward continued carefully. "What I have witnessed has forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my approach to solving our family's needs." Isabella remained silent, sensing that Duke Edward was working towards something significant, and that interruption might prevent him from expressing whatever difficult thoughts he was struggling to articulate. "Alexander has shown no genuine affection for any of these accomplished women, despite their considerable efforts to win his regard," Duke Edward said. "However, I have come to realize that he has already formed a deep attachment to someone who has been caring for him with remarkable devotion and understanding." Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she began to understand the direction of his words, but she dared not assume anything or respond until he had made his meaning entirely clear. Duke Edward rose from his chair and began to pace slowly across the Persian carpet that adorned his study floor, his hands clasped behind his back, in the manner Isabella had observed when he was working through particularly complex problems. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the silver threads in his dark hair, reminding Isabella that he was a man in his prime who had been carrying enormous responsibilities largely alone since his wife's death. "Isabella," he said finally, turning to face her directly, "what I am about to propose will shock you, and I want you to understand that I expect nothing but complete honesty in your response, regardless of what you believe I might wish to hear." Isabella nodded, her heart pounding so forcefully she was certain he must be able to hear it in the quiet of the room. "Alexander has expressed to me in ways both direct and indirect that the person he most desires to have as his new mother is you," Duke Edward continued, his voice steady despite the revolutionary nature of his words. "Moreover, I have come to recognize that you possess every quality that would make an excellent mother to my son, and if you were willing, an invaluable partner to me in the responsibilities that come with managing this estate and our family's obligations." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face as the full implication of his words settled in her mind. She had expected perhaps to be questioned about Alexander's preferences, or even to be dismissed if her attachment to the boy had been deemed inappropriate, but this possibility had never entered her wildest imaginings. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "surely you cannot mean what I think you are suggesting. The difference in our stations, the social implications. It would be scandalous beyond measure." Duke Edward moved to the window, gazing out at the grounds where Alexander could be seen walking alone among the autumn-colored trees. "I am suggesting exactly what you think I am suggesting, Isabella. I am asking if you would consider becoming my wife and Alexander's mother in truth, as well as in the affection you have already shown him." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of impossibility and desire warring within Isabella's heart. Every rational thought screamed that such a match would destroy his reputation, undermine his political influence, and create scandal that would follow them for the rest of their lives. "I cannot ask you to sacrifice your position in society for the sake of a servant's feelings," Isabella said finally, her voice stronger now as she forced herself to consider his welfare above her own dreams. "You have responsibilities to your family name, to your political allies, to the expectations of your social class. I would not have you risk everything you have built for a moment's impulse." Duke Edward turned back to face her, and Isabella was surprised to see not impulsive passion, but calm determination in his expression. "This is not a moment's impulse, Isabella," Duke Edward said firmly, settling into the chair across from her so that they sat at equal level, another gesture that violated conventional hierarchy. "I have spent weeks observing, thinking, and wrestling with the recognition that love and compatibility matter more than social convention when building a family that can withstand life's challenges." Isabella studied his face, searching for any sign that grief or loneliness had clouded his judgment, but she saw only the same careful consideration he brought to all his important decisions. "Your Grace, even if your feelings are genuine, you must consider the practical consequences. Your peers will ostracize us both, your political influence will be severely diminished, and Alexander himself may suffer social consequences throughout his life for having a stepmother of humble birth." Duke Edward leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more intense. "Do you believe that Alexander would be happier with a socially appropriate stepmother who treats him with polite indifference, or with someone who genuinely loves him and understands his needs?" The question struck at the heart of Isabella's deepest convictions about what children required for healthy development. "Love is more important than social standing for a child's well-being," she admitted reluctantly, "but adults must live in the world as it exists, not as we might wish it to be." "Perhaps," Duke Edward replied, "but adults also have the power to change the world through their choices and actions. My wealth and position give me certain freedoms that most people do not possess. I can afford to challenge social conventions if doing so serves a greater good." Isabella felt torn between the longing that his words awakened and the practical wisdom that warned against such a radical step. "What of your business relationships, your political connections, your role in Parliament? You have worked for years to build influence that could be destroyed overnight by such a controversial marriage." Duke Edward was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing her concerns against his own desires and convictions. "My influence means nothing if I cannot use it to secure happiness for my own family," he said finally. "What is the value of social position if it prevents me from choosing the person who would be the best mother for my son and the most suitable partner for myself?" The revolutionary nature of his perspective both thrilled and terrified Isabella, who had never imagined that someone of his elevated status would be willing to risk everything for love and family happiness over social conformity. "Isabella," Duke Edward continued softly, "I am not asking for an immediate answer, but I need you to consider this possibility seriously. Will you think about whether you could be happy as my wife and Alexander's mother, despite the challenges we would undoubtedly face?" While Duke Edward and Isabella were engaged in their unprecedented conversation, the 5 frustrated candidates had gathered in Lady Margaret Ashworth's suite for what amounted to an emergency council of war. The mounting evidence that their month-long campaign was failing had driven them to desperate measures and frank discussions that abandoned all pretense of friendly competition. "We must face the truth," Lady Eleanor Sinclair declared, her practical nature cutting through any remaining illusions. "The Duke shows no signs of developing a preference for any of us, and his son actively avoids our company whenever possible. Something is preventing this arrangement from proceeding as planned." Lady Victoria Pemberton, her legendary beauty marred by the frustration and anxiety of recent weeks, voiced what they were all beginning to suspect. "I believe there is another woman influencing this situation, someone we have not considered as competition." Miss Constance Blackwood, her intellectual pride stung by the apparent failure of her scholarly approach, had been conducting her own investigation into the household dynamics. I have been observing the servants' interactions with young Alexander, and there is definitely one who seems to have unusual influence over the boy. The maid, Isabella, Lady Margaret said grimly. I have noticed how frequently she appears whenever we are attempting to engage Alexander in conversation, and how his entire demeanor changes when she is present. Miss Arabella Worthington, with her characteristic directness, stated what none of them had dared voice explicitly. Are we seriously suggesting that a common servant has somehow positioned herself to interfere with our prospects? Such a thing would be scandalous beyond measure. Lady Eleanor, drawing on her experience with household management, provided a more nuanced analysis. It may not be deliberate manipulation on her part. The boy lost his mother. She has been caring for him during his grief, and he has formed an inappropriate attachment that is preventing him from accepting any of us as suitable replacements. The discussion that followed revealed the depth of their collective frustration and their growing willingness to take actions that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of their visit. Lady Victoria suggested speaking directly to Duke Edward about the situation, while Miss Constance proposed demanding that the troublesome servant be dismissed or reassigned to duties that would not bring her into contact with Alexander. Lady Margaret, perhaps the most politically astute of the group, recognized that direct accusations against a servant could backfire spectacularly if not handled with extreme care. We must be cautious about how we approach this matter. If we appear petty or jealous of a servant, it will reflect poorly on our characters and could eliminate any remaining chances we might have. Their debate continued for over an hour, with various strategies proposed and debated, but eventually they reached a consensus that action of some kind was necessary if any of them were to salvage success from this increasingly embarrassing situation. Later that same afternoon, Duke Edward requested that Alexander join him in the library for what he termed an important father-son conversation. Alexander entered the book-lined room with the careful composure he had learned to maintain during difficult discussions, but his father's unusually gentle expression suggested that this might be different from the formal interviews about his progress with the visiting ladies. Alexander, Duke Edward began, settling into one of the comfortable leather chairs and gesturing for his son to take the matching seat beside him rather than standing formally as protocol typically required. I believe it is time for us to have a completely honest conversation about the situation with our house guests. Alexander felt his stomach tighten with anxiety, fearing that his father was about to force him to make the impossible choice that had been weighing on his mind for weeks. Yes, father. I have been observing your interactions with the 5 ladies I invited here as potential candidates to become your new mother, Duke Edward continued carefully. What I have witnessed has made me realize that I may have approached this entire matter incorrectly. The unexpected admission surprised Alexander, who had been preparing defensive explanations for his failure to develop enthusiasm for any of the distinguished candidates. How do you mean, father? Duke Edward studied his son's face with new attention to the emotions visible there, recognizing how much he had missed during the months when his own grief had made him less attentive to Alexander's emotional needs. I assumed that if I selected appropriate ladies and provided opportunities for natural affection to develop, you would eventually form a bond with one of them. However, I now understand that love cannot be commanded or scheduled. Alexander felt a surge of relief at his father's acknowledgement of what had seemed like an impossible burden. I truly tried to like them, father. They are all accomplished and kind, but I cannot make myself feel what I know you hoped I would feel. Alexander, Duke Edward said gently, I want you to answer a question with complete honesty, even if you believe your answer might displease me. If you could choose anyone in the world to be your new mother, regardless of social position or conventional expectations, who would you choose? The question hung in the air between them, representing either the opportunity Alexander had been longing for or a trap that might force him to reveal feelings that could cause trouble for someone he cared about deeply. Alexander looked directly into his father's eyes, searching for any sign of anger or disapproval, but seeing only genuine interest in his honest feelings. Taking a deep breath, he made the decision to trust his father with the truth that had been burning in his heart for weeks. Isabella, he said simply, if I could choose anyone in the world, I would choose Isabella. The simple honesty of Alexander's answer struck Duke Edward with the force of complete recognition, confirming what he had already begun to understand about the situation, but had needed to hear directly from his son. Rather than expressing shock or disapproval, Duke Edward nodded thoughtfully, his expression remaining calm and accepting. "Can you tell me why Isabella is your choice?" he asked gently, genuinely curious about his son's reasoning and eager to understand the depth of the attachment that had developed. Alexander's relief at not being immediately dismissed or scolded for his unconventional choice gave him courage to elaborate on his feelings. "Isabella understands me, father. When I am sad about mother, she lets me talk about her and helps me remember happy times instead of telling me to be strong and stop thinking about the past. When I have nightmares, she sits with me until I feel safe again, not because it is her duty, but because she truly cares." Duke Edward listened intently as Alexander continued to describe the relationship that had developed naturally between the boy and their maid over the months since Catherine's death. The picture that emerged was of a woman who possessed remarkable intuitive understanding of a child's emotional needs and the patience to provide comfort without trying to rush the healing process. "She teaches me things too," Alexander added, "but not in the way my tutors do, as if I am a vessel to be filled with knowledge. Isabella teaches me by sharing discoveries, by exploring questions together, by making learning feel like adventure rather than obligation." The parallel between Alexander's description of Isabella's teaching methods and his own memories of Catherine's approach to education was not lost on Duke Edward. Catherine had possessed the same gift for making learning feel natural and enjoyable rather than forced or demanding. "Most importantly," Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, "Isabella never tries to replace mother or make me forget her. She helps me understand that loving someone new does not mean betraying someone who is gone. She says that hearts can hold many loves without any of them being less important." This final observation revealed the profound wisdom that Isabella had brought to her relationship with Alexander, recognizing that a grieving child needed permission to love again without guilt, rather than pressure to transfer his affections according to adult schedules and expectations. Duke Edward reached out and placed his hand on Alexander's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both approval and understanding. "Alexander, what would you think if I told you that I am considering asking Isabella to become my wife and your mother, in truth?" Alexander's eyes widened with an expression of joy so pure and complete that it answered the question more eloquently than words could have done. That evening, as the household prepared for dinner, Lady Margaret Ashworth requested a private audience with Duke Edward, ostensibly to discuss her impending departure, but actually to execute the plan that she and her fellow candidates had developed to address what they viewed as improper servant interference in their courtship prospects. Duke Edward received her in the formal drawing room, his manner polite but somewhat distant, as he had become increasingly uncomfortable with the artificial nature of the entire arrangement he had created. Lady Margaret's demeanor was more serious than usual, her typical social pleasantries replaced by an air of concerned gravity. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "I feel compelled to speak with you about a delicate matter that affects not only my own situation, but the welfare of your household and young Alexander's proper development." Duke Edward's attention sharpened at the mention of his son, though he maintained his composed exterior. "Please speak freely." Lady Margaret had rehearsed this conversation carefully, knowing that accusations against servants required delicate handling to avoid appearing petty or vindictive. "I have observed, as have my fellow guests, that young Alexander has formed what appears to be an inappropriate attachment to one of your female servants, an attachment that may be preventing him from forming proper relationships with potential maternal figures of appropriate social standing." The carefully constructed accusation was designed to plant seeds of doubt about Isabella's influence, while positioning the failed courtships as the result of servant manipulation rather than the lady's own shortcomings. Lady Margaret continued her offensive, her voice carrying tones of concerned propriety rather than personal frustration. "While I'm certain the young woman means no harm, her constant presence during Alexander's interactions with us has created a situation where the boy cannot properly evaluate his options for maternal guidance. Moreover, such attachments between children of noble birth and servants can lead to confusion about proper social boundaries that may affect his future relationships and understanding of his station in life." Duke Edward listened to these carefully crafted implications with growing irritation, recognizing the attack on Isabella for what it was, while also understanding that Lady Margaret believed she was acting within accepted social norms. The suggestion that Alexander's genuine affection for someone who had shown him nothing but kindness and understanding was somehow harmful or inappropriate struck him as both cruel and absurd. "Lady Margaret," he said finally, his voice carrying a warning edge that she was too focused on her strategy to recognize, "are you suggesting that I dismiss a valued member of my household staff because she has provided comfort to my grieving son?" Lady Margaret realized too late that her approach had been too direct, but she was committed to her course and could not retreat gracefully. "I am merely suggesting that proper boundaries be maintained for everyone's benefit, including the servants' own welfare." Duke Edward rose from his chair with the deliberate dignity that marked all his movements when he was controlling strong emotion, and Lady Margaret suddenly realized that her carefully planned intervention had gone terribly wrong. The coldness in his expression was unlike anything she had seen during their month-long acquaintance, and she began to understand that she had fundamentally misjudged the situation. "Lady Margaret," Duke Edward said with formal precision that made his disapproval unmistakably clear, "I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding about the nature of the relationships within my household and the reasons for my son's responses to the various ladies I invited here." Lady Margaret felt her confidence evaporating as she recognized that she had somehow stumbled into dangerous territory, but she was unsure how to retreat without making the situation worse. "Your Grace, I meant no offense. I was merely expressing concern for proper social arrangements." "Your concern is noted," Duke Edward replied with glacial politeness. "However, I must inform you that your assessment of both the situation and the proposed solution is entirely incorrect." He moved to stand before the great fireplace, his posture conveying the authority that came with his position and wealth, making it clear that Lady Margaret was about to receive information rather than engage in negotiation. Alexander's attachment to Isabella is not inappropriate or harmful to his development. On the contrary, it represents the healthiest relationship he has formed since his mother's death, and I have no intention of disrupting it. The implication of his words began to dawn on Lady Margaret, and she felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. "Your Grace, surely you cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what you are beginning to understand," Duke Edward continued relentlessly. "Isabella possesses every quality I could desire in a wife, and every quality Alexander could need in a mother. Her humble birth is far less important than her genuine character, her proven devotion to our family, and her remarkable ability to provide exactly the kind of love and understanding we both need." Lady Margaret's shock gave way to horror as the full social implications of his declaration became clear. "The scandal, Your Grace, your position in society, the damage to your family's reputation." Duke Edward's expression softened slightly, not with reconsideration, but with something approaching pity for her inability to understand that love and family happiness might outweigh social conventions. "Lady Margaret, I have spent my entire adult life conforming to social expectations and maintaining my family's position in society. However, I have recently learned that position means nothing if it prevents me from securing genuine happiness for my son and myself." The conversation that followed was brief and devastating to Lady Margaret's hopes, as Duke Edward made it clear that her services as a potential wife and stepmother were no longer required, and that similar conversations would be held with her fellow candidates before their departures could be arranged. Word of Duke Edward's decision spread through the servants' hall with the speed that only truly shocking news could achieve in a household where gossip was both entertainment and survival tool. Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper who had served the Montclair family for over 20 years, found herself in the unprecedented position of managing staff reactions to the possibility that one of their own might become their mistress. The responses varied dramatically according to personality and position within the household hierarchy. The younger maids, who had always liked Isabella's kindness and lack of pretension, were thrilled at the romantic impossibility of her potential elevation. The older, more traditional servants struggled with the social upheaval such an arrangement would create, uncertain how to maintain proper order when established boundaries were so dramatically violated. Cook, a practical woman who had observed Isabella's gentle care of young Alexander during his darkest periods of grief, declared herself firmly in favor of the match, regardless of its unconventional nature. That girl has more mothering instinct in her little finger than those fancy ladies have in their whole bodies, she announced, while kneading bread with unusual vigor. Master Alexander needs love, not lessons in deportment. James, the head footman, represented the conservative faction among the staff, who worried about the long-term implications of such a radical departure from traditional arrangements. "It's not natural," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "Servants marrying dukes leads to chaos. How are we supposed to know our places if the rules keep changing?" Mrs. Whitmore found herself walking a diplomatic line between these opposing viewpoints while trying to maintain household functionality despite the emotional upheaval that had gripped everyone from scullery maid to valet. Her own feelings about Isabella were complex, combining genuine affection for the girl's character with concern about the practical challenges of managing a staff when one of their number had been so dramatically elevated. The most difficult aspect of the situation was Isabella's own apparent state of shock and confusion. She had been moving through her duties like someone in a trance since her conversation with Duke Edward, clearly struggling to process the possibility that her entire life might be about to change in ways she had never dared imagine. When Mrs. Whitmore finally cornered Isabella in the linen closet for a private conversation, she found the young woman sitting among the carefully arranged sheets and towels, with tears streaming down her face. "My dear girl," she said gently, settling beside Isabella on a trunk of bed linens, "what troubles you so? Surely this is what every servant dreams of." Isabella looked up with eyes full of anguish rather than joy. "Mrs. Whitmore, how can I possibly accept such an offer when I know it will destroy everything His Grace has worked to build?" The question revealed the depth of Isabella's internal struggle, torn between the fulfillment of dreams she had never dared acknowledge and her genuine concern for the welfare of the man and boy she had come to love. Mrs. Whitmore recognized that the young woman needed guidance through what might be the most important decision of her life, and she chose her words carefully. "Isabella, dear, in my 20 years with this family, I have watched His Grace make many decisions based on duty and social expectation," she said thoughtfully. "I have never seen him as animated and purposeful as he has been since he began considering this possibility. Perhaps you should trust that he understands the consequences better than you fear he does." Isabella wiped her tears with the back of her hand, struggling to find words for the complex emotions churning within her heart. "But what if I am not strong enough to withstand the criticism and scandal that would surely follow? What if I fail Alexander when he needs me most because I cannot handle the pressure of being a duchess?" The fear was understandable, as Isabella had no experience with the social and political obligations that came with aristocratic position. Her education, while thorough for her station, had focused on practical household management rather than the cultural accomplishments expected of nobility. The prospect of navigating London society as a former servant elevated to duchesshood was genuinely terrifying. Mrs. Whitmore smiled with the wisdom of someone who had observed many social dramas over the years. "My dear girl, you have been managing the most important aspects of duchesshood for months without realizing it. You have won the heart of the heir, earned the respect of the master, and maintained the harmony of this household during its most difficult period. Those are accomplishments that no amount of formal education can teach." Isabella considered these words, recognizing their truth while still struggling with her fears about the future. But what of the social obligations, the political connections, the cultural expectations that come with such a position? I know nothing of court presentations or diplomatic dinners, or the complex relationships that govern aristocratic society. Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew more serious as she addressed these practical concerns. "Those things can be learned, Isabella, but the qualities you already possess, kindness, intelligence, genuine care for others, cannot be taught. I have watched many ladies of high birth who possessed all the proper accomplishments, but lacked the basic human decency to treat their servants with respect or their children with understanding." The conversation continued as Mrs. Whitmore shared observations from her years of service about the qualities that truly made the difference between successful and unsuccessful marriages among the nobility. She spoke of duchesses she had known who had been miserable despite their perfect breeding and accomplishments, and of others who had found happiness through genuine love and mutual respect, regardless of their origins. "The question you must answer," Mrs. Whitmore concluded, "is not whether you are worthy of the position, but whether you love them enough to face the challenges that will surely come. If you do, then trust that love will give you strength to overcome whatever difficulties await. The departure of the 5 distinguished candidates took place over the following 3 days, each lady leaving with whatever dignity she could salvage from the unprecedented situation. Duke Edward handled each farewell with scrupulous courtesy, expressing gratitude for their visit, while making it clear that his decision was final and not subject to reconsideration. Lady Margaret Ashworth was the first to leave, her departure marked by icy politeness that barely concealed her outrage at what she viewed as a betrayal of social order. Her final words to Duke Edward carried a warning about the consequences of his choice that sounded more like a threat than friendly advice. "I hope you will not regret sacrificing your family's reputation for this experiment." Lady Victoria Pemberton's departure was more dramatic, as her legendary beauty had always been accompanied by equally legendary pride. She could not comprehend how she had been rejected in favor of a servant, and her farewell was marked by tears that seemed more related to wounded vanity than genuine heartbreak. Miss Constance Blackwood approached the situation with intellectual analysis, expressing bewilderment at Duke Edward's decision to abandon rational considerations in favor of what she termed romantic impulses. Her academic mind could not reconcile the choice with any logical assessment of relative qualifications and advantages. Lady Eleanor Sinclair's response was perhaps the most mature of the group, as her experience as a widow had taught her that matters of the heart rarely followed predictable patterns. While disappointed, she expressed genuine wishes for Duke Edward's happiness and even offered grudging respect for his courage in choosing love over convenience. Miss Arabella Worthington's Scottish directness served her well in this situation, as she was able to express her disappointment honestly while acknowledging that Duke Edward had the right to make decisions about his own life and family. Her farewell was the most gracious of the 5, suggesting that she might even understand his reasoning, even if she disagreed with his choice. Alexander watched the departures from his bedroom window, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety, as each carriage disappeared down the long drive leading away from Montclair Castle. Relief, because the pressure to form attachments he did not feel was finally ending, but anxiety because he understood that his father's decision to pursue Isabella would bring consequences that might affect their entire family. When the last carriage had disappeared, Alexander found Duke Edward in his study, staring out at the now quiet grounds. "Father," he said softly, "are you certain about what you are planning to do?" Duke Edward turned to his son with an expression of calm determination. "Alexander, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Are you prepared for the difficulties we may face?" Alexander straightened his shoulders with a resolve that reminded Duke Edward powerfully of Catherine. "If it means Isabella can truly be my mother, I can face anything." 2 days after the last of the candidates had departed, Duke Edward requested that Isabella meet him in the castle's conservatory, a glass-enclosed garden room that had been Catherine's favourite retreat, and where Isabella had often brought Alexander during his periods of deepest grief. The choice of location was deliberate, representing continuity between past happiness and future hope. Isabella arrived at the appointed time wearing her best dress, though it was still clearly the attire of a servant, rather than a guest. Her nervousness was evident in the careful way she held herself and the uncertainty in her eyes as she approached Duke Edward, who was standing beside a fountain surrounded by blooming orchids. "Isabella," he began, taking her hands in his, with a gentleness that sent tremors through her entire body, "I have spent the past weeks coming to understand something that perhaps I should have recognized much earlier. You have already become the heart of our family in every way that matters." Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to words she had never dared hope to hear. Duke Edward continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction as he spoke. "You have shown Alexander more genuine maternal love than he has received since his own mother's death. You have provided comfort during his darkest hours, guidance without judgment, and the kind of understanding that has allowed him to heal while honoring his mother's memory. Moreover, you have offered me something I thought I would never find again, the possibility of sharing my life with someone who truly understands what matters most." Isabella tried to speak, but Duke Edward gently placed a finger against her lips, indicating that he was not finished with what he needed to say. "I know the obstacles we face," he continued. "Society will be scandalized, political relationships may be strained, and we will face criticism from those who believe that love should be subordinate to social expectations. But I have come to realize that the opinion of people who value convention over genuine human connection is not worth preserving. Then, to Isabella's amazement, and the amazement of several servants who were secretly watching from nearby doorways, Duke Edward knelt before her on the conservatory's marble floor, producing a simple but elegant ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Isabella Hartwell," he said formally, his voice carrying across the glass-enclosed space, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife and Alexander's mother?" The proposal echoed through the conservatory, and within minutes through the entire castle, as servants carried the news to every corner of the estate. Isabella stood frozen for a moment that felt like eternity, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered and the courage it represented. Finally, with tears streaming down her face, she whispered the word that would change everything. Yes. News of Duke Edward Montclair's engagement to his former maid spread through London society with the speed and destructive force of wildfire. Within hours of the announcement reaching the capital, drawing rooms throughout Mayfair buzzed with shocked conversations, hastily written letters carried urgent gossip to country estates, and the gentlemen's clubs filled with heated debates about the implications of such an unprecedented social revolution. The Countess of Pembroke, Lady Margaret Ashworth's mother, was among the first to organize resistance to what she termed an assault on the natural order of society. Her drawing room became the headquarters for a campaign designed to ostracize Duke Edward and his bride-to-be, with invitations to social events being conspicuously withdrawn and business relationships suddenly becoming strained. Lord Ashworth, Lady Margaret's father and a political ally of Duke Edward's in Parliament, found himself in the awkward position of balancing personal outrage with practical political considerations. Duke Edward's wealth and influence could not be ignored, even by those who disapproved of his marriage choice, creating complex calculations about the wisdom of complete opposition. The betting books at White's Club filled with wagers about how long the marriage would last, whether Isabella would be able to adapt to aristocratic life, and what the long-term consequences might be for Duke Edward's political career. Opinion was sharply divided between those who admired his courage in choosing love over convention and those who viewed his decision as a betrayal of his class and responsibilities. The newspapers seized upon the story with enthusiasm, recognizing its potential to sell copies while allowing them to explore themes of romance, social change, and the tension between tradition and progress. Some publications treated the engagement as a fairy tale come true, while others warned darkly about the dangers of abandoning established social hierarchies. Perhaps most significantly, the controversy began to reveal fault lines within aristocratic society itself, with younger members more likely to express admiration for Duke Edward's choice, while older, more traditional voices called for social sanctions that would punish such revolutionary behavior. The royal court's reaction was particularly crucial, as Queen Victoria's opinion could significantly influence whether Duke Edward and Isabella would be accepted in the highest levels of society or permanently excluded from court functions and official recognition. Meanwhile, similar conversations were taking place in the servants' halls of great houses throughout England, as the news spread through the network of domestic workers who moved between aristocratic households. The reaction among servants was generally more positive, with many seeing Isabella's elevation as vindication for the worth of their own contributions to the families they served. While adult society debated the propriety and implications of his father's engagement, Alexander Montclair found himself facing a different but equally challenging set of circumstances. Word of the unusual engagement had reached his tutors, his riding instructor, and the families of other young aristocrats who might have been his friends, creating a social situation that required considerable maturity for a 10-year-old to navigate. During his weekly riding lesson with Mr. Hartwell, no relation to Isabella despite sharing her surname, Alexander encountered his first direct criticism of his father's choice. The riding master, a traditionalist who believed in strict social hierarchies, could not resist expressing his disapproval of the engagement. "Young master," Mr. Hartwell said while adjusting Alexander's stirrups, "I hope you understand that this situation with your father and the servant girl will make things difficult for you in proper society. You may find that invitations become scarce and that suitable friendships become harder to maintain." Alexander, who had inherited both his father's dignity and his mother's quiet strength, straightened in his saddle and looked directly at the riding instructor. "Mr. Hartwell, I believe you are speaking of Miss Isabella, who is soon to become my mother and your future Duchess. I would appreciate it if you would address her with the respect her position and her character deserve." The firmness in Alexander's young voice surprised the riding instructor, who had expected either embarrassment or defensiveness, rather than such dignified correction. The boy continued with composure that seemed far beyond his years. Moreover, if proper society cannot recognize goodness and love when they see it, then perhaps proper society is not as proper as it believes itself to be. I would rather have Isabella as my mother and face criticism than have any of those fine ladies who cannot see past their own reflections long enough to care about a child's happiness. This exchange, like many others occurring throughout their social circle, began to establish the pattern that would characterize Alexander's response to criticism of his father's choice. Rather than apologizing or hiding from the controversy, he consistently defended both his father's decision and Isabella's character with a confidence that impressed many adults while occasionally intimidating them. When young Lord Pemberton, Lady Victoria's nephew, attempted to tease Alexander about having a servant mother during a chance encounter at the local church, Alexander's response was swift and decisive. "My mother-to-be has shown me more kindness and understanding in 6 months than some people show in a lifetime. If you cannot appreciate that, the failing is in your understanding, not in her character." These encounters were building Alexander's confidence and clarifying his own values, while also serving notice to their social circle that the Montclair family would not be cowed by criticism or social pressure. Despite the social controversy swirling around their engagement, Duke Edward was determined that his wedding to Isabella should be conducted with appropriate dignity and celebration. He understood that the ceremony itself would make an important statement about how he viewed both Isabella and their union, and he refused to allow social pressure to force them into a secretive or apologetic approach. Isabella, meanwhile, found herself overwhelmed by the practical challenges of preparing for a role she had never imagined occupying. Mrs. Whitmore took charge of the immediate necessities, working with a carefully selected dressmaker to create a wedding gown that would be elegant without being ostentatious, appropriate for a duchess without forgetting Isabella's humble origins. The guest list for the ceremony presented particular challenges, as Duke Edward needed to balance his desire for a meaningful celebration with the reality that many of their traditional social contacts had withdrawn their support. However, he was pleasantly surprised to discover that several longtime friends and political allies were willing to attend, viewing his marriage choice as either admirable or, at minimum, his personal prerogative. Alexander threw himself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm that surprised and touched both his father and Isabella. He appointed himself supervisor of flower arrangements, insisted on helping with menu planning for the wedding breakfast, and took particular interest in ensuring that Isabella's few remaining family members would be comfortable during their visit to the castle. Isabella's sister, Margaret, who worked as a seamstress in a nearby town, arrived a week before the ceremony to serve as her only attendant. The reunion between the sisters was emotional, as they had seen little of each other since Isabella entered service, and Margaret was initially overwhelmed by the grandeur of Montclair Castle and the magnitude of her sister's transformation. "Bella," Margaret whispered during their first private conversation, using the childhood nickname that no one at the castle had ever heard, "are you certain you can be happy in this world? It is so different from everything we have ever known." Isabella's response revealed how much she had grown during her months at Montclair Castle and her weeks of engagement to Duke Edward. "Margaret, I have learned that happiness comes from love and purpose, not from comfort or status. I love Alexander as if he were my own son. I have come to love Duke Edward with all my heart, and I believe I can serve this family and estate well. The rest I must learn to manage as it comes." The wedding preparations also involved practical lessons in deportment, social protocol and household management that would be essential for Isabella's success as a duchess. Duke Edward arranged for a retired lady's companion, Miss Thornton, to provide intensive instruction in the social skills Isabella would need to navigate aristocratic society. November 15th dawned cold but clear, with pale sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Montclair Castle's chapel, where Duke Edward Montclair and Isabella Hartwell would be married in a ceremony that defied every social convention their world had ever known. Despite attempts by some prominent families to organize a social boycott of the event, the chapel was filled with guests who had chosen to support the couple's unconventional union. Isabella, wearing a gown of ivory silk that had been created specifically for her by London's finest dressmaker, stood at the back of the chapel with her sister Margaret, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves before the ceremony that would transform her from servant to duchess. The gown, while elegant, avoided the ostentation that might have seemed inappropriate for a woman of her origins, instead emphasizing simple beauty and dignity. Alexander, serving as his father's best man despite his youth, stood beside Duke Edward at the altar, wearing a miniature version of formal morning dress that made him appear remarkably grown up for his 10 years. His pride in the occasion was evident in his straight posture and the broad smile that he seemed unable to suppress, despite the solemnity of the moment. Duke Edward himself appeared more relaxed and genuinely happy than he had since Catherine's death, his choice to follow his heart rather than social expectation having freed him from the weight of duty that had burdened him for so long. He wore his formal military uniform, the medals and decorations serving as a reminder of his service to crown and country, even as he defied social convention. The chapel filled with murmurs of appreciation as Isabella walked down the aisle, her natural grace and beauty evident even to those who had come primarily out of curiosity about this unprecedented social event. Duke Edward's expression as he watched her approach left no doubt about the depth of his feelings, while Alexander beamed with joy that infected many of the assembled guests. The ceremony itself was conducted by the local vicar, who had known the Montclair family for decades and who chose to emphasize the Christian virtues of love, compassion, and family unity rather than dwelling on social distinctions. His sermon spoke eloquently about the courage required to choose love over convenience and the importance of building families on foundations of genuine affection rather than mere compatibility. When Duke Edward and Isabella exchanged vows, their words carried special meaning, because everyone present understood the risks they were taking and the challenges they would face together. Isabella's promise to love and honor her husband was particularly moving because it represented not only personal commitment, but acceptance of responsibilities that would require her to grow far beyond her current capabilities. The moment when Duke Edward placed his grandmother's ring on Isabella's finger and pronounced her his duchess was met with applause that seemed to shake the ancient stones of the chapel walls. The wedding breakfast held in Montclair Castle's Great Hall represented Duke Edward's determination to celebrate his marriage with appropriate dignity regardless of social disapproval. The hall had been decorated with autumn flowers and elegant table settings that honored both the grandeur of the occasion and the season of their union. The guest list, while smaller than might have been expected for a ducal wedding under normal circumstances, included individuals whose presence carried particular significance. Lord Blackwood, Miss Constance's father, had chosen to attend despite his daughter's disappointment, viewing Duke Edward's decision as a matter of personal prerogative rather than social rebellion. Several military colleagues from Duke Edward's army days had travelled considerable distances to show their support, valuing loyalty and character over conventional arrangements. Perhaps most surprisingly, Lady Ashford, an elderly duchess known for her unconventional views and sharp tongue, had not only attended but requested the honour of proposing the first toast. Rising with the aid of her walking stick, she commanded attention through sheer force of personality. "My friends," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "we have witnessed today something that our society rarely sees, the triumph of genuine emotion over calculated advantage. Duke Edward Montclair has chosen to marry for love, and Isabella Hartwell has accepted the challenge of becoming not just a wife but a duchess, knowing full well the difficulties that await her." The toast continued with Lady Ashford's characteristic directness about the social challenges the couple would face, while affirming her respect for their courage and her confidence in their ability to succeed. Her words carried particular weight because of her age, experience, and unassailable social position, helping to legitimize the union in ways that might influence other members of society. Alexander's contribution to the celebration came in the form of a brief speech that surprised everyone with its maturity and eloquence. Standing beside the head table, he expressed gratitude for Isabella's love and care while acknowledging his father's wisdom in choosing happiness over convention. "Today I gain not just a new mother, but the certainty that our family will be guided by love rather than duty alone," he said, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "I am proud to be part of a family that has the courage to choose what is right over what is expected." The remainder of the celebration proceeded with warmth and genuine joy, as guests who had initially come out of curiosity found themselves caught up in the authentic happiness of the newly married couple and their son. The first months of Duke Edward and Isabella's marriage unfolded against a backdrop of continued social scrutiny and gradual adjustment to their new roles as an unconventional family unit. Isabella's transformation from servant to duchess required not only changes in wardrobe and social behavior, but fundamental shifts in how she viewed herself and her place in the world. The practical challenges were immense. Isabella had to learn to manage a household staff that had once included her as a subordinate member, navigate complex social situations where her origins were either ignored through politeness or discussed through whispered gossip, and assume responsibilities for estate management and charitable activities that required knowledge she was still acquiring. Duke Edward proved to be a patient and supportive husband, understanding that Isabella's success would require time and experience rather than immediate perfection. He arranged for continued lessons in social deportment and estate management, while ensuring that she had opportunities to develop confidence in her new role gradually, rather than being thrown immediately into the most challenging situations. Alexander thrived under Isabella's official maternal guidance, his academic performance improving markedly as he felt more secure in his family relationships. The nightmares that had plagued him since his mother's death became less frequent, and his natural curiosity and intelligence began to flourish in ways that impressed his tutors and pleased his father. However, the social challenges proved more persistent than any of them had hoped. Invitations to major social events remained scarce, political relationships required careful navigation, and Isabella faced the constant pressure of knowing that her behavior would be scrutinized and judged more harshly than that of any duchess born to the position. The most difficult moments came during necessary social appearances, where Isabella encountered barely concealed hostility or condescending behavior from members of society who viewed her elevation as an affront to their own positions. These experiences tested her courage and determination, while also strengthening her resolve to prove worthy of the trust Duke Edward and Alexander had placed in her. One particularly challenging evening occurred during their first major social appearance at a political dinner, where Isabella had to navigate complex conversations about policy matters while managing the subtle snubs and calculating assessments of other guests. Duke Edward's steady presence and Alexander's obvious pride in his stepmother helped her maintain composure, but the evening left her emotionally drained and questioning whether she would ever truly belong in such settings. Despite these difficulties, there were also moments of triumph and acceptance that suggested their unconventional union might ultimately succeed in changing some hearts and minds about the importance of character over breeding in aristocratic marriages. 6 months into their marriage, Duke Edward and Isabella began to notice subtle but significant changes in their social reception that suggested society's initial shock was gradually giving way to grudging acceptance and, in some cases, genuine respect for what they had accomplished together. The turning point came during a charitable event organized by Isabella to benefit orphan children in the local parishes. Her natural compassion and practical understanding of poverty allowed her to create programs that were both effective and sustainable, earning praise from clergy, local officials, and even some aristocratic ladies who had initially viewed her with suspicion. Lady Pemberton, Victoria's mother and one of the most vocal early critics of the marriage, surprised everyone by attending the charity event and contributing generously to Isabella's causes. While her manner remained somewhat reserved, her presence represented a significant shift in attitude that other society members noticed and began to emulate. Alexander's obvious happiness and improved development provided perhaps the strongest argument in favor of his father's controversial choice. Members of society who encountered the family together could see that the boy had flourished under Isabella's care, his confidence and academic achievements serving as practical evidence that love and understanding mattered more than social pedigree in child-rearing. Duke Edward's political influence, rather than being destroyed by the marriage as some had predicted, evolved into a different but still significant form of power. While some traditional allies distanced themselves, he found new support among progressive-minded politicians and influential individuals who admired his willingness to challenge social conventions for the sake of personal happiness and family welfare. Isabella's gradual mastery of her ducal responsibilities also contributed to changing perceptions. Her intelligent questions during political discussions, her innovative approaches to estate management, and her genuine care for tenant families demonstrated capabilities that impressed even those who remained dubious about her origins. The royal court's eventual acknowledgement of the marriage, while not enthusiastic, provided the official recognition that allowed other members of society to normalize their acceptance without appearing to rebel against established order. Queen Victoria's pragmatic approach to social change allowed for grudging tolerance of unconventional arrangements that produced positive results. Most importantly, the marriage itself proved to be genuinely happy and successful, with Duke Edward and Isabella developing the kind of partnership that many aristocratic marriages based purely on social compatibility failed to achieve. Their obvious mutual respect and affection gradually won over observers who had initially predicted failure and scandal. As Alexander approached his 12th birthday, the positive effects of his unconventional upbringing became increasingly evident to everyone who encountered him. The combination of his father's aristocratic education and Isabella's intuitive understanding of emotional development had produced a young man who possessed both the social skills expected of his station and the genuine warmth and empathy that made him popular among peers and adults alike. His academic achievements impressed his tutors, but more significantly, Alexander had developed the kind of moral courage and independent thinking that marked him as a natural leader among young people of his generation. When classmates at his exclusive school initially attempted to tease him about his stepmother's humble origins, Alexander's confident defense of his family and his articulate explanations about the importance of character over breeding gradually won their respect and eventually their friendship. The relationship between Alexander and Isabella had deepened into something approaching the bond between a natural mother and son, with the added dimension of gratitude for the conscious choice they had all made to become a family. Alexander never forgot that Isabella had chosen to love him and face social difficulties for his sake, while Isabella never took for granted the trust both father and son had placed in her ability to help guide their family's future. Duke Edward watched his son's development with pride that was intensified by the knowledge that their unconventional family arrangement had provided Alexander with advantages that might not have been available through a more traditional marriage. The boy had learned to value people for their essential qualities rather than their social positions, to think independently about important questions rather than simply accepting conventional wisdom, and to have the courage to defend his convictions even when they were unpopular. During a conversation about Alexander's future education and the possibility of attending university, Isabella surprised both father and son with the depth of her understanding about the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Her insights about preparing Alexander for leadership while maintaining his essential humanity demonstrated how much she had grown in her role as stepmother and duchess. Alexander possesses both the privileges and the responsibilities that come with his birth, she observed during their family discussion. But he also has the advantage of understanding that those privileges are meaningful only when used to serve others and improve the world around him. The wisdom in her words reminded Duke Edward why he had been right to choose love and character over social convenience, and why their unconventional family had succeeded in ways that more traditional arrangements might not have achieved. Alexander's own reflections on his unusual upbringing revealed remarkable maturity and insight about the lessons he had learned from his family's choices and challenges. By their second wedding anniversary, Isabella had not only adapted to her role as duchess, but had begun to excel in ways that earned genuine admiration from even her harshest early critics. Her charitable work had expanded beyond local orphanages to include innovative programs for improving education and working conditions for women throughout the duchy's various properties and enterprises. Her approach to these social problems combined practical understanding, gained from her humble background, with the resources and influence that came with her elevated position, creating solutions that were both compassionate and effective. The schools she established for tenant children became models that other estates sought to replicate, while her programs for training young women in useful trades provided alternatives to domestic service or factory work. Duke Edward found himself increasingly relying on Isabella's insights, not only for household management, but for complex decisions about estate development, tenant relations, and investment strategies. Her intuitive understanding of how policies affected ordinary people, combined with the education in business and politics she had acquired since their marriage, made her a valuable advisor, whose counsel he sought on matters that went far beyond traditional feminine concerns. The political dinner parties they hosted had evolved from awkward social obligations into genuine opportunities for meaningful discussion and relationship building, with Isabella's warmth and intelligence helping to create an atmosphere where diverse viewpoints could be explored respectfully. Her ability to ask thoughtful questions and listen carefully to responses made their gatherings popular among intellectuals and progressive politicians who appreciated the quality of conversation available at Montclair Castle. Perhaps most satisfying to Isabella was the recognition that Alexander's continued flourishing served as powerful testimony to the success of their unconventional family arrangement. The boy's confidence, academic achievements, and moral development provided evidence that love and understanding were indeed more important than social pedigree in child-rearing. When Lady Margaret Ashworth, her first and most bitter critic, requested a private audience during a county social gathering, Isabella agreed with some trepidation to hear what the woman had to say. The conversation that followed represented a form of vindication that Isabella had never dared hope to achieve. "Your Grace," Lady Margaret began with formal courtesy, "I owe you an apology for my initial reaction to your marriage and my failure to recognize your qualities. Observing your accomplishments over the past 2 years has taught me that my understanding of what makes a suitable duchess was far too narrow and conventional." The apology, while somewhat stiff in its delivery, represented genuine acknowledgement of Isabella's success and marked a significant shift in social acceptance that would influence other members of their circle. 5 years after the scandalous wedding that had shocked English society, the Montclair family had established itself as one of the most respected and admired households in their county and beyond. Duke Edward's political influence had evolved rather than diminished, with his reputation for independent thinking and genuine concern for his constituents, making him a valued voice in Parliament on issues ranging from social reform to economic policy. Isabella, now fully established as a duchess in every sense of the word, had become known throughout England for her innovative charitable work and her role in promoting education and opportunities for women of all social classes. Her programs had been studied and replicated by reformers across Europe, earning her recognition as one of the leading social progressives of her generation. Alexander, now 15 and preparing for university, had grown into a young man whose character reflected the best qualities of both his parents and his stepmother. His confidence, intelligence, and genuine concern for others marked him as someone who would likely make significant contributions to society, regardless of which career path he eventually chose to pursue. The marriage that had begun as a scandal had gradually transformed social attitudes about the importance of character versus breeding in aristocratic unions, with several other prominent families subsequently choosing love over convention in their own matrimonial arrangements. While society had not completely abandoned its preference for matches based on social and economic compatibility, the success of the Montclair marriage had demonstrated that unconventional choices could produce positive results. During quiet evenings at Montclair Castle, when the family gathered in the library that had once been Catherine's favorite room, Isabella sometimes reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from servant to duchess, from loneliness to love, from uncertainty to confidence in her ability to contribute meaningfully to the world around her. Duke Edward, watching his wife read to Alexander, or discuss his studies with the same patience and insight she had shown from their earliest days together, felt profound gratitude for the courage that had allowed him to choose happiness over convention and genuine partnership over social appropriateness. Alexander, preparing for examinations or working on essays about literature and history, understood that his unusual upbringing had given him advantages that his peers might not possess. The ability to see beyond surface appearances, to value character over status, and to believe that love and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The portrait of Catherine that still hung in the morning room served not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of continuity, representing the love that had created their family and the love that had allowed it to grow and thrive in unexpected directions. On Alexander's 18th birthday, as he prepared to leave for Oxford University, where he would study law and political science, the Montclair family gathered for a celebration that marked not only his coming of age, but the complete success of the extraordinary family they had created together through love, courage, and determination. The guest list for Alexander's birthday celebration included many of the same people who had attended Duke Edward and Isabella's wedding 5 years earlier, along with new friends and allies who had been drawn to the family by their reputation for integrity, intelligence, and genuine concern for others. The contrast between the uncertain atmosphere of their wedding and the confident joy of this celebration demonstrated how completely their unconventional union had been vindicated by its results. Isabella, now an accomplished duchess whose opinion was sought by politicians, reformers, and other aristocratic ladies throughout England, stood beside her husband and stepson with the quiet pride of someone who had not only adapted to her elevated position, but had used it to make meaningful contributions to society. Her transformation from servant to social leader represented one of the most remarkable personal achievements of her generation. Duke Edward's toast to his son acknowledged not only Alexander's academic and personal accomplishments, but also the role that Isabella's love and guidance had played in shaping the young man's character and preparing him for future leadership responsibilities. "Alexander," he said, raising his glass to the assembled company, "you represent the best hopes of our family and our society. Your mother Catherine gave you life and early love. Isabella has given you wisdom and continued nurturing, and together they have created in you someone who understands that true nobility comes from service to others rather than from accident of birth." Alexander's response revealed the maturity and eloquence that would serve him well in his future career, but more importantly, it demonstrated the values that had been instilled through his unusual upbringing. "I have been blessed," he said, "to learn from 3 remarkable parents that love is stronger than convention, that courage is more valuable than comfort, and that the greatest achievements come from choosing what is right rather than what is easy. Isabella, thank you for teaching me that families are created by choice and sustained by affection rather than merely inherited through blood." As the celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing in the great hall that had once witnessed Isabella's first tentative steps into aristocratic society, the success of their extraordinary family arrangement was evident in every aspect of their lives together. The maid who had been chosen by a 10-year-old boy to be his mother had indeed become not only a beloved stepmother and devoted wife, but a duchess whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of Montclair Castle, proving that love, courage, and determination could triumph over the most entrenched social conventions. In choosing each other, Duke Edward, Isabella, and Alexander had created something more valuable than social approval or conventional success. They had built a family founded on genuine love, mutual respect, and shared commitment to making their world a better place for everyone they encountered.